So after you pick out your glaze colors that you're going to use, look closely at the bottles and figure out the names of your glazes. What you're going to do first is record the names of your glazes on your glaze ticket. This might seem annoying, but I can't tell you how many times students have really liked the glaze colors they used and then forgotten what it was by the time they got to their next project. So just like your bisque ticket, please fully fill out everything at the top of your glaze ticket so I can keep track. And then you can push that to the side. We will be using it throughout, so don't lose track of it. Now I'm going to backtrack for just a minute and talk about these glaze chips. Every glaze that we have has this little color chip that shows you what it looks like on our clay body. Now, it's important to pay attention to this because what you see is what you're going to get with your project. So for example, right now, I'm showing you that whenever your project has texture on it or raised areas, that glaze is actually going to move away from the raised areas and sink into the lower areas. So don't be surprised if you don't get full, even coverage. Same thing with this ancient copper. It's not necessarily the clay body color behind it, but the raised areas become a more dark brown. Meanwhile, you have colors like this one that gets full coverage. It does not matter what the texture looks like. It is solid all throughout. So these color chips really tell you everything. This one is a more satin finish as opposed to the other ones I just held up, which are more glossy. I do have some glazes with more matte finishes, so really look at those color chips. They tell you what you're going to get, so there are no surprises. So just look again at this nice comparison shot. You have the real glossy shine of the Blue Norse compared to the satin finish of the teal. Now we'll get to the actual glazing. So one of the first things you want to look at as you get your glazes is the consistency of the glaze. Over time, some of the glazes do dry out and become a little chunky. If that's the case, just let me know and I can hopefully bring it back to life. But what you're aiming for is the consistency of heavy cream. So a good habit to get into is to get your glaze brush and stir that glaze up because oftentimes the good sediment tends to sit at the bottom. And all of that sediment, which are actually all the glaze materials, is what you need to bring that color out. If your glaze is too watery, you will not get good pigmentation. This is especially true for some of the glazes which have color bursts or speckles, such as C-note. Those little bits of stone at the bottom are what create the color burst, so you definitely need to get those if you want the speckles. Otherwise, C-note is actually going to look exactly like Norse blue. So when you begin glazing, the fundamental rule of brush-on glazes is you need 3 solid layers. And I am going to really emphasize this in my video because oftentimes your 3 layers look a lot different than my 3 layers. So look right here. This is what I see a lot. Students who just basically dry brush the glaze on, really struggling to get even coverage. What you need is to dip so often and really, rather than brush, lay that glaze on. So look at the wet layer that I am leaving behind. I am dabbing and laying a thick layer on. This is so important because I will show you a comparison of what a not thick layer does. If you have any grooves like my little brickwork detail here, just again, I'm getting a nice drop on my brush and dabbing it into those sunken areas to make sure it sits in there. All areas should be covered. Bare clay left behind after the glaze firing does not look very cute. So speed this up a little bit until I get to my added detail, in which I'm going to talk about slight overlap. So pay attention here. I have what is actually meant to be an old school kiln added on. And another tip is really make sure you go as close to your add-ons as possible. So what I do is I get a nice amount of glaze on my brush and I actually put my brush down and push into my add-on. Way too often I see students leave little hairline strips of bare clay in between their 2 different colors. I'd rather see a slight overlap of your 2 colors. Yes, you might get a little bit of color blending where the 2 colors meet, but it's gonna look so much more complete and professionally done than leaving strips of bare clay in between your 2 different colors. So again, I'll speed this up for you because it does take me about 15 minutes for my first full layer of glaze. I know our first project is not going to have an inside area, but as we get to mugs and other vessels, yes, you absolutely need to glaze the inside of your project. Think about your mugs at home. They are not raw bare clay. They are glazed. It is what creates that watertight seal that makes anything functional food safe. There is only one part of our project that we do not glaze, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But this is where we go back to our glaze ticket, and I'm going to take my brush and create a little dot in that first blob, indicating that I've completed one full layer. You can kind of see from this now that the outside is mostly dry. There are color changes. It becomes a little bit more chalky. You do need to wait for your first layer to fully dry. Otherwise, you're just moving the first layer around rather than actually laying another layer on top. So this is going to be my comparison mug where I glaze very badly. So again, this is what I see often: the dry brushing, the rushing, not waiting for your layers to dry. So I will actually do an area of this where I do quote unquote 3 layers, and I'll show you what it looks like after I have fired it in comparison to my kiln mug that has full good solid 3 layers. I'll also show you what it looks like to not slightly overlap your 2 different colors, thus leaving areas of bare clay. All right, so I'm going to designate this area to the left of my little guy as what many students consider to be 3 layers. What I did not do, even though I technically brushed on it 3 times, is I did not wait for the glaze to dry in between, and I did not have a nice fully loaded brush. So again, once these are fired, you will see what the difference looks like based on whether or not you waited for those layers to dry and you had those nice thick coats of glaze. So putting that ugly comparison to the side, I am now ready for my second coat of glaze on the nice mug. I know the inside's a little wet, but that should dry by the time I'm done with the outside. Typically your first coat dries really fast. It's usually that second to third coat that you need to wait a little longer because there is already moisture in your bisqueware, so it takes a little longer for that glaze to dry. So again, I'm going to speed this up. You do not need to watch me fully brush this on. I'm just showing it to you to really emphasize how long this actually takes. I think it took me overall glazing time, not including waiting time, about 30 minutes to fully glaze this piece. So if you come to me and say that you are done glazing with your 3 layers and multiple colors after 10 minutes, I'm probably not going to believe you. When in doubt, add another layer. Don't forget to mark your second layer done on your glaze ticket to help you keep track. And at this point, I actually need to put this mug aside and wait about 10 to 15 minutes for that second layer to dry. So in the meantime, what I will do is I will take my second color, which is Ancient Copper, and I'm going to glaze my little dude on this mug with only 1 or 2 layers, really lightly, once again, just so you can see that comparison. And just about 15 minutes later, this mug is just about ready for the final layer. It's still a little wet, but I'm going to go for it anyway. And I will spare you. I think you get the gist. If you ever get glaze in any unwanted areas, it's as simple as taking a damp sponge and just rubbing it off. Don't have your sponge soaking, or else that water will drip all over your freshly glazed project. Just damp and keep rubbing it until it goes away. This is especially important when it comes time to talk about your bottoms. You can never have any glaze on the bottom of your project. So what I'm doing right now is I am cleaning up the bottom. Any glaze that is left on the bottom of your pot is likely to stick to the kiln shelf and will therefore probably get ruined. Not only that, but more importantly, it will ruin my kiln shelves, which are very expensive and hard to replace. So please, you should all know how to do this. Wipe your bottoms. Any projects that have glaze on the bottom will not be fired and will be put to the side until you fix it. Same goes for, like I typed before, that bottom 1/4 inch of your project. Try not to have your glaze go all the way to the bottom. I'm now going to finish this up with my second color, Ancient Copper. So I happen to know for a fact that this glaze tends to like heavy application more than 3 layers, especially because this is a little bit more watery than my previous glaze. This is just from me experiencing it in the past, so what I do recommend is sometimes the glaze bottles do tell you whether or not to apply heavy or to just apply your standard 3. So check the glaze bottles. This one doesn't actually say anything, so like I said, you just kind of get the hang of these glazes as you use them. So I will eventually apply 4 layers overall, but what I'm going to emphasize here is that slight overlap. So as I get to the edge of this little kiln applique, I'm going to show you how I make sure that I'm touching the blue Norse on the edge. Once again, I don't want that strip of bare clay in between the colors. Ultimately, what's going to happen is this glaze is so watery that it tends to just drip down the edges, more so than I want, but at some point there's only so much you can do. If you really want to be more patient than I am making this demo video, you can wait much longer for your glazes to dry. But the overall effect, it's negligible for me, so I just keep going with it. But again, just take note, I'm going nice and carefully along that edge, making sure to overlap the blue Norse. And of course you can see I chose a much smaller paintbrush, so while the fan brush is great for application over large areas, you're obviously welcome to use smaller brushes for smaller areas. And as each layer progresses, I know glazing can get tedious. It's honestly my least favorite part of pottery, but it is so worth it if you take your time. With each corresponding layer, just even along those edges, make sure you're getting those nooks and crannies fully covered. So I am officially done. My glaze ticket is fully filled out. Just like with your bisque ticket, there is a checklist at the bottom for you to make sure everything is done, especially that wiping of the glaze from the bottom. So when you are done, your project can go in the kiln room on your class shelf along with your glaze ticket. And a measly 2200 degrees Fahrenheit later, you can see and enjoy the fruits of your labor. So here is my final product with my 3 thick layers of blue Norse, all on the inside, all on the outside, except for the bottom. And there's that beautiful ancient copper, which looks nice and metallic once it's finished. Now, by comparison, here is my ugly mug. You can see, obviously, these areas that I did really fast are no good. Oftentimes, the underside of handles are forgotten. You can see that there's all that bare clay behind my little man, which just looks sloppy. There aren't enough layers, so the ancient copper just looks brown. And then you have my area that has the supposed 3 layers. And even that is still super light in comparison to my 3 thick layers. So just take a look-see. And there you have it, the rules of glazing. The least fun, but most rewarding part of pottery.